Liberalism. Chapter 6. The struggle for recognition by the instruments of labor in the metropolis and the reaction of the community of the free. Section. The excluded and the struggle for recognition. We have seen that the liberal tradition is shot through with two macroscopic exclusion clauses. In reality, there is a third, that directed at women, which in fact presents peculiar characteristics. When they belonged to the upper classes, they formed part, albeit in a subordinate role, of the community of the free. One thinks in particular of female slave owners. The women's liberation movement was only able to acquire a mass social base later, when women previously confined to a position of slavery or restricted to the inferior levels of a caste society were able to participate in it. The development of liberalism in the 18th and 19th centuries is explained, in the first instance, by the struggle waged by the bipedal machines of the metropolis, on the one hand, and slaves and colonial populations or populations of colonial origin, on the other. In both cases, even more than for the achievement of specific objectives, the excluded protested against the fact that the dignity of man was denied them. This was a struggle for recognition, in the sense specified by Hegel in a celebrated chapter of The Phenomenology of Spirit. The shackled black depicted by abolitionist propaganda demanded freedom, stressing, in the text attached to the image, that he too was a man. In his turn, Toussaint Louverture, the great protagonist of the San Domingo Revolution, invoked, quote, the absolute adoption of the principle that no man, whether red, black, or white, can be the property of his fellow being, end quote. Similar accents could be heard in Paris immediately following the July Revolution, when popular periodicals accused, quote, bourgeois notables of insisting on viewing workers not as men, but machines. Nothing but machines called upon to produce exclusively for the needs of their masters. After the Revolution of February 1848, the achievement by proletarians of political rights demonstrated in their view that they too were finally beginning to be raised to the, quote, rank of men. Condorcet emphatically recognized this status in black slaves, but denied it to their white masters. Similarly, Engels, referring to the English workers whom he was, quote, happy and proud to have known, and who suffered a, quote, slavery worse than that of the American Negroes, exclaimed, quote, I have found you to be men, members of the great universal family of humanity, who proclaimed the cause of humanity, trampled underfoot by capitalists engaged in an indirect trade in human flesh, in a barely disguised slave trade, end quote. Corresponding to the struggle of the excluded to be recognized in their dignity as men was the polemic against the Declaration of the Rights of Man on the other side. In the liberal camp, the most celebrated intervention was Burke's. His condemnation of this subversive theory was absolute. It paved the way for the political and social demands of, quote, hairdressers and tallow chandlers, to say nothing of a number of other more servile employments, for the demand of the, quote, swinish multitude, or at any rate people whose, quote, sordid mercenary occupation entailed a mean, contracted view of things, end quote. Some decades later, in Bentham's view, the 1789 Declaration of the Rights of Man was nothing but a pile of, quote, anarchical fallacies. It sanctioned egalite between all men. The English liberals' comment was sarcastic. Beginning of long quote. All men, i.e. all human creatures of both sexes, remain equal in rights. The apprentice, then, is equal in rights to his master, and he has as much liberty with relation to the master as the master has with relation to him. He has as much right to command and punish him. End quote. And hence the, quote, absurd principle of egalite can only please fanatics and the ignorant multitude. The Declaration referred to law as an expression of the, quote, general will, but it is clear that therewith censitary restrictions of the vote could not be justified. The very theorization of property right contained in this solemn text was suspect to Bentham. The concrete object of such right was not clearly specified, and hence it involved a right which, once again, belonged, quote, to every individual without any limit, even the propertyless person suffering from hunger. Beginning of long quote. In other words, a universal property right is established, that is, everything is common to everyone. But because what belongs to everyone belongs to no one, what follows from it is that the effect of the Declaration is not to establish property, but to destroy it. And that is how it was understood by Babeuf's supporters, those true interpreters of the Declarations of the Rights of Man, who can be criticized for nothing but being consistent in applying the most false and absurd of principles. End of quote. Condemning these abstract general principles, for which Britain rightly displayed extreme repugnance, and which, when pronounced by, quote, famished mouths, could only result in catastrophe, Bentham referred to Malouet, one of the few in France to have attempted to dispel, quote, the cloud of confused ideas. In fact, it was the Anglo-Manes who sought to block the ratification of the Declaration of the Rights of Man. In appealing to general principles and metaphysical concepts, Malouet warned people were playing with fire. They risked inciting the, quote, immense multitude of propertyless men, the unfortunate classes of society, the men placed by fate in a condition of dependency, and lacking enlightenment and means. They must be taught just limits, rather than the extension of natural liberty. End quote. It is significant that one of those to adopt a clear position against the category of rights of man was Malouet, who subsequently played a prominent part in the argument against abolitionism. It was this second aspect that played a central role in the United States, where within the white community the social question did not have the significance it possessed in France, but where the conflict over black slavery became increasingly impassioned. A particular target was the statement, contained in the Declaration of Independence, that, quote, all men are created equal, with the right to enjoy certain unalienable rights. Present in it was the, quote, metaphysical folly that subsequently found more concentrated expression in the French Revolution. This was the charge formulated by the, quote, American Burke, namely Randolph, who in this context explicitly appealed to the British liberal. Born in the wake of the revolt against the alleged, quote, imprescriptible rights of the king invoked by the British Crown, the United States now risked succumbing to the folly of the, quote, imprescriptible rights of black slaves, end quote. In similar fashion, Calhoun drew attention to the poisonous fruits of that place in the Declaration of our Independence, which claimed to confer, quote, the same right to liberty and equality on all men, end quote. This was the abolitionists' starting point in the fanatical struggle they had unleashed against black slavery and Southern institutions as outrageous on the rights of men. In England, it was, with his focus mainly on the colonies, that Disraeli characterized the rights of man as nonsense in 1880. The struggle for recognition waged by colonial populations, or populations of colonial origin, proved particularly long and complex. It would only achieve decisive results in the 20th century. For now, we must turn our attention to the struggle waged by the bipedal machines in the capitalist metropolis and within the white community. End section.